Well, hello and welcome back. I'm Justin Briley. This is Unbelievable, the show that aims to get you thinking. And if you're here with us on YouTube, don't forget you can like and subscribe to the show. You can also find loads of good stuff over in the info too, links to our regular newsletter and ways to support the show as well. We'll even send you a free ebook if you do that. Just check out the links in the info. Today on the show, we're discussing critical race theory and asking, is it compatible with Christianity? We're returning to the issue of race and culture as we debate CRT, as it's called for short. We'll find out what it is and why many Christians are split over it. And in a nutshell, but this is definitely going to be what we're going to be debating during the course of this show, you could say that critical race theory is the view that racism is at the center of the power dynamics of oppressed and oppressor, which lie behind the disadvantages and inequalities that exist in our world between people. Well, that's one definition anyway. We'll see what Neil and Rasool, my guests on the show today, have to say and how they define it. Neil Shenvi is a homeschooling theoretical chemist and Christian apologist. And in recent years, he's become well known for his work critiquing critical theory. And he believes that the worldview of CRT is at odds with the Christian gospel and is worried by the embrace of its teachings by many evangelical leaders. Rasool Berry is teaching pastor at the Bridge Church in Brooklyn. And in a recent article titled Critical Grace Theory, he argues that CRT can actually be a helpful tool for understanding power dynamics in our world and working towards the peace and justice embodied in the gospel. So welcome, Neil and Rasool. Great to have you with me on the show today. Neil, I'll start with you because I know that you've followed Unbelievable for a while, and you'll be aware of some of the discussions we've had over the summer with various guests around Black Lives Matter and those sorts of issues. But tell us about how you particularly came into, this being your specialism, if you like, in the last few years. What particularly got you engaged with critical race theory and critical theory in general?
Yeah, it was unexpected. So I was involved in apologetics for a long time, and I was very apolitical. I wanted to show non-Christians and my atheist colleagues as a scientist that Christianity was true, the gospel was true, that Jesus was who he claimed to be. And I kind of avoided cultural apologetics, as it's called. But then a few years ago, I began noticing both people that I knew personally and Christian leaders beginning to drift theologically, and I couldn't figure out why. It often began with an interest in social justice, but then they began espousing beliefs that were harder and harder to reconcile with orthodoxy, and some even became atheists. And I couldn't figure out why until I met my friend and collaborator, Dr. Pat Sawyer, who has a PhD in education and cultural studies, teaches at UNCG, and he wrote a dissertation that invoked critical theory, and he's really an expert in this area. And when I heard what he was doing, I said, this sounds very familiar. And so we got connected, and I began to read voraciously and began to understand what was happening both in our culture and even in the evangelical church. And I think in the last, say, 6 months, we've really seen that cultural shift accelerate as more and more of mainstream culture and more of evangelical churches embrace these ideas.
Great to meet you on the show, and it's been really interesting reading and hearing some of your stuff over the last year or two. Also new to the show, Rasool Berry joins us, pastor of the Bridge Church in Brooklyn. Do you want to just describe what your church is like in Brooklyn, Rasool?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been there for 5 years. We're a 6-year-old church plant in the heart of downtown Brooklyn. Our average age is 27-year-old, Black and brown, millennial Gen Z is who we attract. People, we wanted to make a church for people who had kind of gotten tired of church and reimagining how to do that in a way that was still solid theologically, but culturally relevant and really speaking to the needs of where people are today. So that's kind of where we are as a church at the Bridge.
What's it been like pastoring a church through this last crazy 6 months? Both the double whammy of obviously coronavirus, which has affected all churches, but also, of course, all of the issues around the George Floyd protests and all of the tensions that has brought to the surface across the culture.
It's been unlike anything I've ever experienced before. I mean, obviously living in New York City, we were hit really hard. outside of Wuhan, like the hardest hit in the very beginning, and even it surpassed that. And so very early on in March and, April, we had to, shut down and just, I have parishioners who have one parishioner lost 6 family members.
Wow.
In the span of a month. Several others had their mothers on their deathbeds, and one died, but miraculously was resuscitated. But yeah, so it was pretty intense going up to May, and then of course the other pandemic of racial violence hit with Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and then George Floyd. And it was kind of a twin just storm of difficulty to have to walk people through and pastor people through, especially people who were directly affected and very much afraid to go out jogging, like Ahmaud Arbery, or what would happen if they went out into the street. And so we had to very much be very thoughtful in our preaching and in our ministering to know how to respond to these things that were very much at the forefront of what a lot of our parishioners were experiencing.
Sure. I'd love to chat with you more about that, but perhaps that'll come out in the course of the conversation today, some of the practical elements of how this is all obviously impacting people. This is a really interesting topic, though, for me, because I've seen this phrase crop up so much in my social media, in articles, and I'm not even quite sure I still quite understand, because it's a very, I think, it covers a lot of ground, this phrase critical race theory, doesn't it? But if it's possible, and this is always a difficult question, if it's possible in a nutshell, let's maybe start with you, Neil. How would you define this idea of critical race theory?
I would define it according to several core central tenets. So I'm going to take these from Yasso's paper, Whose Culture as Capital, which is cited over 6,000 times, which is a huge number of citations. And it provides Sheila's 5 tenets of critical race theory in education. I'll summarize them, but I can give you the direct quotes, but I can kind of take my word for it that I'm not twisting it. So the central tenets of critical race theory, according to Yasso, are: first, racism is permanent, pervasive, and normal. Racial oppression has not disappeared, it has just evolved. 2, racism, sexism, classism, heterosexism, etc. are all inextricably linked forms of oppression that must be fought simultaneously. Third, claims of objectivity, neutrality, universality, meritocracy, and colorblindness, all in those scare quotes there, are mechanisms to disguise racism and oppression. They're excuses, they conceal actual racism. And then finally, the experiential knowledge or lived experience of people of color is critical to understanding racism. And one of the ways that racism operates is by suppressing what's called the epistemologies of people of color, how they know the truth. And we need to recover that by listening to their narratives, their stories that counter the typical colorblind narratives you'll hear from mainstream culture. So in a nutshell, that's what, I could quote, I said Yasso, I could quote Harper, Patton, and Wooden, Kumasi, Crenshaw, Delgado, and Stefan Schick, Gottesman, and pretty much all the scholars I've read outline critical race theory in roughly the same way.
I won't get you to go into detail on the wider field of critical theory, because we could do a whole other podcast on that, I'm sure. But that's a helpful kind of guide to some of the key points as you see them, Neil. Would you add anything to that, Neil, to Rasool, or would you want to give your own definition of how you understand critical race theory?
Yeah, well, I want to note first that it's interesting that Neil started with a discipline of education, which was not the original field from which this theory emerged, which was from the legal studies. And I think that alone kind of reflects and reveals the kind of amorphous way that this thing has kind of evolved over time and been picked up in, interdisciplinary, across the academy, and can in some ways be hard to pin down. There were some things that were shared in that definition that I go, yeah, I think that's intrinsic. There were other things that I go, that I don't necessarily, have seen that as definitely something that would be considered universal. One definition I found helpful on Purdue University's site was critical race theory, or CRT, is a theoretical and interpretive mode that examines the appearance of race and racism across dominant cultural modes of expression. In adopting this approach, CRT scholars attempt to understand how victims of systemic racism are affected by cultural perceptions of race and how they're able to represent themselves to counter prejudice. I think that's obviously it's more narrow in its scope than the far-reaching implications that Neil defined. And I think that's actually kind of instructive to this conversation, is that, you can probably find a few different definitions that wouldn't align up to each other.
And it's probably fair to say sometimes, Neil, that people try to push too much onto critical race theory potentially, because it can become a bit of a buzzword to mean just generally political correctness or something like that, can't it?
Right. Yeah. And that's why I try to go to the literature and not, and say, well, this is what I find across, again, I could name, and it's a huge paper I just cited, 6,000 citations. These are extremely, central core tenets that are espoused by everyone. Now, Rasool, I'd ask, the definition you gave, it sounded kind of nebulous. It's like this movement, it's a mode of expression. But the question I would ask is, if you define it that broadly, well, why wouldn't someone like Thomas Sowell, who's a well-known Black conservative, would he be doing critical race theory under your definition?
No. I think that, not based on that definition, I would say no.
So why exactly?
Well, explicitly, from what I understand, Thomas Sowell really hinges and focuses a lot on what would be considered the declining significance of race in general as an overall concept, or the overuse of it from a liberal kind of political philosophy approach to as a means of understanding disparities in our world and in our culture. Whereas critical race theory, one of the primary tenets actually is that race has explanatory power of interpreting and understanding the significance of those same disparities. So I think the very nature of it as a methodology or a theory is something that would not fit with what Sowell is trying to do.
That's right. And you mentioned that Sowell thinks it's declining in importance, but as I pointed out, one of the tenets that I've found everywhere is that it's permanent, pervasive, and normal, not aberrant. Again, I can quote like Delgado's and Stefancic critical race theory introduction, and Crenshaw's CRT. My point is just that I think if you define it too nebulously, then it's hard to pin down what. So, for example, I've seen people say, well, in some sense, Martin Luther King was a critical race theorist, even though he came, 10 or 20 years before the very first critical race theorist. But if you define it that broadly, then I guess, sure, it can be compatible with Christianity. But I really want to pin down what, again, scholars, when they get specific about what it is, what are their beliefs? Those beliefs are what are incompatible, not just some vague, method or some movement. Movements can mean a lot of things. Yeah.
What might be helpful in a sense is to move fairly quickly onto what your problems are then. Sure. And that might reveal kind of the differences that you and Rasool take when it comes to the way you understand critical race theory. Just firstly, before we get to that, Rasool, I'd be interested to hear from you how you think this way of looking at racism, understanding that has informed the protests and the conversations that have been going on in the last 4 or 5 months.
That question actually leads to kind of my primary concern or critique of the whole conversation as a whole. So just a little bit of background. I'm born and raised in inner city Philadelphia, went to University of Pennsylvania, majored in Africana studies and sociology. And so I was all up in the social sciences as a discipline, as a perspective, became a Christian as a freshman, was very much formed by evangelicalism as I was developing in my own faith. And, but throughout that process, both from an academic training standpoint, even though that was my degree, like this never was a thing that came up I'd never heard about it. Like, in fact, I didn't start hearing about it like a lot of Black Christians until as we were talking about issues of injustice, people were putting that label upon me. So I started to look at what are they talking about? I don't even understand what you're accusing me of. And then I go back and I go, okay, So there's a few problems with that. The first is that really the big question is the fact that many people, and I would say, from what I've read from Neil, have a uncritical race theory. What I mean by that is they have no theory on race. Like they just assume that it's a category that's just as neutral as gender or class. Whereas if you learn and go back to the history of race, going back to the 15th century, the Native American Christian author Mark Charles has done a lot of reading on the doctrine of discovery and how essentially the idea of race was codified through a series of papal bulls that were used to justify how it could be that Europeans could take over and discover, using scare quotes, lands that were already inhabited. And the essential explanation was that because they weren't human. It was a theory of humanity that said, okay, these people are not as fully human beings. The image of God is not as fully revealed in who they are than it is in who we are as Europeans. And so as a result of that, we get to conquest, rape, pillage, confiscate lands for the sake of the gospel, for the sake of Christ. That was part of so it was theology, it was a anthropology, a way of looking at people. And all of those things become codified in law, both in Europe and in the United States. So whether it's the Declaration of Independence, where you see we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and then you go a few lines later and it says, it complains that King George doesn't allow them to take over the merciless Indian savages, or if it's the Constitution, which calls, slaves, enslaved people, Black people, 3/5 of a person. This was a system, a way of looking at humanity that is now trying to be critiqued. And that's is part of the thing that I don't see. And so when you talk about what's happening on the streets, one of the things that Brian Stevenson talks about, the author of Just Mercy, which just came out as a movie, is that while the North may have won the tactical war, that the South won the narrative war, that there was a war about the nature of who are human beings and who gets to participate in our society fully. And so that's where you get Jim Crow segregation. That's where you get all the things that happened in the 100 years that followed the end of the Civil War from 1865 to 1965. You have this, attempt to maintain a racial caste system that was in place because the very nature and notion of race was very much the foundation upon which these unjust systems emerge. And so I feel like if you don't have that understood, if that's not a full theory that you can actually understand and break down, then critical race theory begins to be even more confusing, because now you don't have a holistic way of actually seeing what it is, the fact of what they're trying to critique in the first place. So lastly, when I look at these movements of protest, very much they're related to the same struggle, because these in the same way that Brian Stevenson talked about, once the Civil War ended, there was still 100 years of racial disparities that was codified de facto into law. Well, now we have de jure, where it's not necessarily legally explicit, but the vestiges of those systems still remain, and the ideas and the narratives of those systems still remain.
So if Neil, CRT, critical race theory, is essentially unpacking and understanding that those disparities that have emerged through centuries of the way that race has been thought of and categorized and put into law and so on. In that sense, Rasool says it's potentially a helpful way of understanding, and it doesn't replace our Christian understanding necessarily, but it can inform it. It can help us to, do justice and love mercy and treat each other all as made in the image of God and so on. So what are your key criticisms of this theory? And I'm sure then we'll have to go to a quick break and we'll hear Rasool's responses.
Well, maybe we'll do that after the break. But I want to just say that actually one of the things I appreciated about Pastor Rasool's essay was that he says, as a result of common grace, we can learn from philosophers, scholars, and activists, regardless of their personal beliefs, and that we don't have to wholeheartedly embrace CRT or reject all it has to say about race and justice. He said that, and I actually agree. And one of the things I think that CRT gets right is how the concept of race and white and black races actually was a social construct that did create an effective racial casteism. I'm going to read, Rasool, I know that I write a lot, but you said I didn't really have a theory of race. Well, actually, I'm going to read from a quote from an essay that Pat and I wrote on Ekemini Yuan's Sparrow Talk with you a year ago, but we wrote, the idea and concept of race is a modern development that came to prominence in the 17th century. We said it was a purposeful attempt to justify slavery and to concentrate power within the hands of people of European origin. The U.S. did indeed develop a kind of racial caste system, which placed whites at the top and blacks at the bottom. So I understand that. I think this is one of the areas that critical race theory does get right. And we can say, look at history and say, yeah, actually, they're right. When I read quite a bit of critical race theory. When I read their views on the construction of race in the U.S., I generally think they get it right. So my concerns are not the things they get right. My concerns are, number one, the things they get wrong. And more than that, the fact that their foundations, their core tenets on which they build these theories are deeply wrong and poisonous. And I guess we'll do that after the break, Justin.
Well, look, we've got a couple of minutes. We've got a few minutes. So why don't you give us maybe 1, 2, maybe 3 if we can squeeze them in, and then we'll go to Rasool
Sure.
after
Let me
the
just
break.
give you one. So critical race theory, like I said, I can quote many critical race theorists saying this is a core tenet of the theory, but they connect racism, sexism, classism, and heterosexism as all linked forms of oppression. The term they use is interlocking systems of oppression. That's an extremely central idea. And actually, you can see in Pastor Rasool's essay, he picks up on that. He says, why is it so hard for some Christians to see the value of CRT's critique of racism? Because they're mapping out race. And he says, when people map out by power, by pointing out racial or gender privilege, it can cause our defenses to go up. I'm quoting him again. He says, I know that defensive reflex firsthand because when my male privilege needed to be called out, he gets defensive. So in other words, Pastor Rasool sees that, yeah, there's white privilege and there's male privilege, but critical race theorists would say yes, and there's class privilege and heterosexual privilege. They're all interlocking. So for example, in his essay, Critical Race Theory, Archie Chapman, Fiery Music, John Calmore writes, adherents of critical race theory see an interlocking set of oppressions that extend beyond the singular base of race and include the bases of gender, economic class, and sexual orientation. Ibram Kendi, the author of How to Be an Anti-Racist, says, to be an anti-racist is to be a feminist. To be truly a feminist is to be anti-racist. We cannot be anti-racist if we are homophobic or transphobic. Wildman and Davis write, white privilege derives from a system of white supremacy, male privilege, and heterosexual privilege result from the gender hierarchy. So again, these are critical race theorists who are saying it's all connected. You can't just pick apart race. You have to see race, class, gender, sexuality, physical ability, age, immigration status as interlocking forms of oppression. And right off the bat, Christians are going to say, wait a minute, I don't believe that the gender binary is oppressive. I don't believe that gender roles are oppressive. But critical race theory is built on, especially since intersectionality in 1989, 91 with Kimberly Crenshaw, it's built on the recognition that these things are indeed related forms of oppression. So that there's one huge area where we have to say that fundamental idea that's, again, in the core tenets of critical race theory must be rejected by Christians.
We'll come back to you for a response on that in just a moment, Rasool. Thank you very much. And I'm sure there'll be other issues to discuss in the ways that Neil, the issues Neil has with aspects of CRT. But we're doing an in-depth dive on this subject today on Unbelievable. Is critical race theory compatible with Christianity? We're asking. My guests are Neil Shenvi and Rasool Berry. We'll be back after a short break.
What I want to invite Roger to comment on is why couldn't the mental realm include an infinite consciousness?
It's too much like us. It's too much like putting it like the Greek views of the gods in some sense. They were too much like us.
They were finite and contingent. Here we're talking about a metaphysically necessary source.
I admire this noble aspiration to find the highest possible ideal. It's almost as if you're proposing a new religion to meet this new challenge.
It's not a new religion. Yes. What it is something that sits in the same place. It addresses some of the same needs, but it is not founded on the same principle.
If the New Testament says that Jesus did X, Y, and Z, Did he do it or not?
I don't think it's a story that's made by committee. Am I going to have a later literary genius who comes up with a great story like this? Or am I going to say, no, Jesus is the genius, and somehow that story has basically been preserved?
Welcome back to the second part of today's show. We're asking, is critical race theory compatible with Christianity? Neil Shenvi and Rasool Berry are my guests, and I'll make sure there are links from today's show to them if you want to find out more about their work and their ministries. So in that last section, Neil was saying the problem with embracing critical race theory, Rasool, is that you then have to embrace everything else about critical theory and all these various different categories of power and oppression and so on. And that might lead to Christians being uncomfortable potentially with saying we need to deconstruct gender categories and sexuality categories and other things. So how much do you agree with that you have to kind of take it as a whole in that way?
Yeah, well, that's a good question, a good point that Neil brought up. And it actually I'm going to go a little bit outside of my field into his world of chemistry for a second. So I'm going to get myself in a lot of trouble. But the word chemistry comes from alchemy, which referred to the earlier set of practices that encompass elements of chemistry, metallurgy, philosophy, astronomy, astrology, mysticism, and medicine. And of course, when we think about alchemy, the biggest thing, right, of the idea of turning other materials into gold. And yet over time, that word got to a place and changed in its significance and all of its clarity to bringing it to a point now where it involves theories and discoveries that function within kind of the realm of established science. Now, I kind of feel like sometimes I might use the word chemist, and someone is investing into me all of the alchemy history and all of the converse, problematic astronomy and mysticism philosophies that I'm like, well, that's not what I mean by when I say a chemist. And so in the same way, there is, I think, a problem with what I'm addressing. If this was merely in the realm of the academy and theorists, we wouldn't really be having this conversation. But what's happened is, and again, how I had discovered the term and how many of my other brothers and sisters in the faith and of color have experienced this, is we're talking about George Floyd's being killed after his being knelt on for 8 minutes and 46 seconds and saying this is unjust, something should be changed, the law, that we live in a racist society. And then we are told, oh, you have just been held captive to this ideology called critical race theory. And so now it's like, well, what are you talking about? I'm just trying to respond to the very injustices that I'm seeing all around me. And so I think that one of the differences that exists is that there are people who have theories about race. Like I said, they're uncritical race theories. And by the way, Neil, what I meant by that wasn't that, you didn't have any kind of a concept of race as a social construct. But what I have found, and again, I haven't read, you write a lot, bro. So I know. I haven't read it all, but in the aspects that I saw, there wasn't a full, robust analysis of what is happening today and how that is influenced by this concept of race, both not just talking about slavery, not just talking about 50 years ago, but the very concept of race and how it's used now and how it's intrinsically been tainted by these unbiblical, sinful patterns of thinking about humans and organizing humans. And so in terms of, so I just wanted to say, I'm only in this conversation because I'm being given a label that I really don't care that much about. And I really want the church to be talking about the death that is in the street, the disparities. COVID right now has a disproportionate impact on people of color, in some places twice as likely to die as white people. We're seeing this across education, across, healthcare, across, just economics, every field. And it's like, that needs to be talked about. I would much rather have a conversation about that than I would about a theory that is amorphous and whatnot. But anytime you talk about that in many Christian circles, you are giving this title. So that's the dilemma of saying, okay, there are elements of this that resonate with me. But the last thing I'll say to that is that it resonates because the Black church was already talking about this over 150 years ago. I have a whole tradition that I am tapping into, from Frederick Douglass, the Sojourner Truth, to Harriet Tubman, to Richard Allen, we're always talking about this. But yet when I talk about it, I'm being labeled as being influenced by social science.
As you say in your article, you know, where you're tapping into this ain't, you know, this long running tradition,
right.
And obviously leaders of the civil rights movement like Martin Luther King and so on, and they wouldn't necessarily have known what you meant by critical race theory, but it's just that there is obviously overlap between sort of with what critical race theory says and the impetus for justice
right.
at a more simple level. But so what's the problem there then, Neil? Because many people would say, you know, it's not as though the Bible doesn't talk about categories of oppressed and oppressor. It's not as though the Bible doesn't talk about us having to see things in a fresh way. You know, when I think of Paul's words about don't be conformed to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. There's something about almost, you know, being awakened, the wokeness, if you like, of Christianity is to not get trapped into patterns. And at its best, as I understand critical race theory and how Rasool sees it, it's about seeing beyond sometimes the ways in which culture shapes us, to see other people's points of view and how they experience life in that way. So if that's the kind of the positive way in which we could categorize CRT, what's your problem with that kind of way of looking at it? Okay,
so it happens a lot of times that, you know, critical race theory and critical theory more broadly has taken terms that are familiar words like oppression, and it's actually explicitly redefined them. So for example, as Pastor Rasool says in his essay, that critical theorists, you know, broadly are attuned to the abuse of power, which can be the result of, he says, quote, wealth, ideological dominance, hegemony, he says, or the power to shape language and or physical domination via state-sanctioned violence, to name a few. And that's exactly right. So critical theory, critical race theory, does view oppression not just as coercion and tyranny, but as the power to shape ideology, right? That's oppression. And that's how they understand it. And that's why they would say we live in, say, as Pastor Rasool said, a racist society. Why? Because we have this, the ruling class, whites, has imposed their system, their ideology onto culture. They've classified whites and blacks, and they've classified themselves as normal and valuable, and they've classified people of color as abnormal, lesser, and other. And that means there's an oppressor group, whites, and oppressed groups, people of color. That's how you get these categories. They would see that's how the theory works. But if that's your definition of oppression, that oppression occurs not just through violence and tyranny, but through ideological power, hegemony, well, then you say, well, I accept that with respect to race, but if that's your definition of oppression, then you also have to believe that women and LGBTQ people are oppressed because the ruling class, men and heterosexuals, have imposed their norms and values on culture in the same way. That's what I'm getting at here, Justin, is that it's not that CRT's views just come out of nowhere. They come out of, again, sort of a worldview, an ideology, and everything fits together. It's coherent. So we hear a word like oppression, we're like, well, the Bible talks about oppression as a bad thing, but we have to understand that the way they're using that word, or words like racism and white supremacy, are in unusual ways that are informed by their, it's called a worldview, call it their larger ideology, and that's the problem. But forget, set aside the issue of gender and sexuality. So Muslim Christians say, well, okay, I see that that's a problem. A lot of critical race theorists say that that's central to their discipline, that seeing sex, gender, race, class as all intertwined, that's important to them, but I have to reject that as a Christian. I'll just use it to view race, okay? Well, here's the problem there. They even get race really wrong. Another big, huge conflict is in their view of epistemology, how you know the truth. So again, one of their core tenets is that racism hides behind claims of objectivity and colorblindness, and to really understand racism, we have to listen to the lived experience of people of color, right? And, well, what does that do? If you really believe that, what do you do when someone says to you that your gospel is not the real gospel, that what you believe is this truncated, individualistic, white evangelical gospel? For example, in his book, Reconstructing the Gospel, Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove writes, the gospel of white evangelicals hasn't interrupted our racial habits, it's reinforced them. In America, racial politics has always been Christian, co-opting the poor refugee Christ to defend white supremacy. We miss the basic message of the gospel. He goes on and on about how we all have embraced slaveholder religion. Now, if you're a white person, now he's white, interestingly, but if you're a white person, how do you respond to that claim that you don't know the gospel? Well, if you say, well, but the Bible says this, they'll say that's your white, European, Western interpretation of the Bible. You're blinded by your white privilege. And so, but no, my interpretation is objectively true. Well, that's objectivity is a cloak for racism and white supremacy. What if you're a person of color? Like I'm half Indian. What if I say, wait a minute, that's not true. The gospel I believe really is the gospel the Bible teaches. Well, in that case, critical race theorists will say that I have internalized oppression. I've imbibed white evangelicalism, and so I'm just parroting back their talking points. So there's no way to answer them. This epistemology says...
Is this why, people land hard sometimes on people like when Beth Moore, for instance, well-known Bible teacher, on Twitter says, I need to decolonize my theology bookshelf or whatever.
Yeah.
You have a problem with that because you think that suggests there are many ways of interpreting scripture. There are many ways of that there isn't one objective truth, if you like, in the gospel.
Well,
that's the claim that's coming out from that.
So not exactly. So critical theorists are actually not postmodernists in a radical sense. They believe truth is out there, but they believe that oppressed people have special access to that truth. So when she says, I want to decolonize my bookshelf, think how weird it would sound to say, I need to decolonize my math book or my science textbooks. I need to decolonize those. No, you don't. Why? Well, because those are objectively true. Well, wait, are your Bible commentaries not? That's the question. So
right.
What does she mean exactly? So I'm not saying clearly we can get a lot.
I'd love to hear Rasool's response to this because this I think is key, Rasool. Is the Bible commentary written by a white Anglo-Saxon Eurocentric person inevitably colored by that person's experience, and that you don't get the full truth from that unless you also are putting it next to people's other experiences and the way they interpret the gospel?
Man, there's so much. I'm just going to try my best. There was so much there to respond to. It reminds me, I'm at Reformed Theological Seminary right now, and shout out to Jay Harvey, the executive director. He gave me this as a food for thought on this. The church is being brought ethical concerns and is responding with epistemological critique. That's like a man telling you he's bleeding and you ask him, how did you come to that conclusion? That's part of what's happening here. That's hard to wrap your head around. It's similar to, I feel like, Job's friends of just kind of pummeling someone with a bunch of, rejoinders when you're like, yo, I'm suffering. But to answer that epistemological thing, because I did see, Neil, you wrote that to critical theorists, these totalitizing, comprehensive, exclusive claims are utterly unacceptable from the perspective of contemporary critical theory. God is the ultimate oppressor, and you refer to lived experience as a problem with that, or and I think that from an apologist standpoint, we know that there are different forms of knowledge. There's propositional knowledge, this, if this, then that. There's procedural knowledge, such as learning how to ride a bike. There's direct awareness, knowledge by acquaintance. I know how it feels to stub my toe. So when you say, yo, I stubbed my toe and it hurt, I can be like, yeah, I understand that. However, if someone were to say, wow, I just had twins and it hurt, I'd have to be like, I don't know what that's like. I have no frame of reference for understanding what it's like to give birth to twins. Some of this is just basic epistemology, and it's stuff that even in our own tradition, even in the Reformed tradition, you see people like Herman Bavinck who talk about the various ways in which knowledge, come to us, and how important it is for us to be aware of it. I think that there's an extreme that happens in either side of this, where on the one end you have epistemological hubris that says, of course I can know and explain and understand everything that you are going through and see, and I have no blinders. And then you have an extreme epistemological suspicion and skepticism of all truth. And I'm not arguing for either of those. I'm saying that what we can say, and the Bible doesn't argue for either of those, but what it does say is that there are certain things that people who are marginalized and oppressed are going to catch and experience by way of their lived experiences. That's not to say, and ironically, even the very people he's quoting, some of the greatest influencers in my own thinking on race have been white people. So it's not that that critical theorists like Jean Stefanchik, who is white herself, who's writing this, they're not saying that it's impossible for someone to understand something and move in that other direction, and you have to just be an oppressor and that's your own state. But it is saying that there needs to be room made for a value of an epistemology that says that we need to listen. So we need to listen to people whose perspective from being marginalized and oppressed by this racist system that has existed since for the last several centuries, what they talk about. So when someone talks about decolonizing theology, I'm so glad you brought that up, Neil, because you asked, like in one of your essays, what does that exactly mean? Does that mean we have to jettison documents like the Westminster Confession? No, absolutely not. That's not what it means. But what it does mean when we talk about decolonizing theology, we also have to look at the fact that if I read Jonathan Edwards and see that he was one of the most influential evangelical thinkers of the time, and he justified chattel slavery. If I read George Whitefield and I see that he also justified chattel slavery, changed his position when it became financially convenient. When I see anti-Semitism in certain writings of various people, that I have to recognize and acknowledge that in addition to the lofty, beautiful truths that I hold to, and I can say, yes, this is God revealed, inspired revelation, I also have to look at the things that said either your complicity in a system and a behavior in a system that was racist, or your silence in a system. When we look at just over the last 100 years, I mean, Bob Jones University, which Bob Jones was a well-known evangelist in his time, one of the most famous, started a university in South Carolina that barred interracial marriage until the year 2000 on their campus, 20 years ago. So this isn't, you're talking this millennial that I have to look at that. I hope that a Black person was at Bob Jones University and was decolonizing their theology when they were told that they were less than a person. Absolutely, we have to do that.
Neil.
Yeah, I would just say, Rasool, you said, do we have to get rid of, the creeds of the Reformation? Absolutely not. Well, that's why I said, well, what do you mean by that? You would not mean get rid of the Reformation, get rid of the all-male books of the Bible and find some female authors who, write inspired literature. You're not saying that. But here's the thing, some people are. So at the conference Liberating Evangelicalism, which was sponsored by University Press, Eerdmans, North Park Seminary, Fuller Seminary, and Evangelicals for Justice, Professor Angela Parker tweeted this out. She said, "Inerrancy and infallibility are orthodoxies of white supremacist thought." Lisa Sharon Harper said, "The doctrines of inerrancy shut down our ability to look at the Bible in all its complexity and is a doctrine of whiteness." So some people some evangelicals really are saying things like decolonize your theology by getting rid of all these musty old doctrines like inerrancy.
But some chemists believe in evolution, and some, I don't understand why we can eat the meat and spit out the bones in every other discipline, but then when it comes to something about critiquing race, it's like, oh my gosh, somebody says something like that, so that means I have to wrestle with if everybody believes that.
Sure. So I totally agree. One of my not pet peeves, but I definitely hear the concern that, hey, I talk about race and everyone calls me a critical race theorist. I talk about justice, they call me a cultural Marxist. I get that I'm not even remotely doing that. Okay, I see that concern. It's legitimate. The question today is, what about critical race theory itself? If you actually ask a chemist, do you believe in like alchemy and the four humors? And they say, no way. What are you talking about? But if you ask a critical race theorist, what defines your discipline? They will tell you these things do. So I have no problem with saying, I want to use some of these ideas that are actually true. Ideas like race is a social construct. That's a true statement, right? I can, and if a critical race theorist says that, if a Muslim says that, I can affirm it because it's actually true. But the underlying tenets that are central to their discipline, I have to reject. And so, for example, like lived experience, I completely agree that our lived experience has some value evidentially. I had Cheerios for breakfast, or I said I had a protein bar for breakfast. That's my lived experience. It's also true. You don't have to question me, but here's the thing. The ultimate authority is not our lived experience. It's Scripture, and what's more, because of the perspicuity of Scripture, all people from all social locations can interpret it well. Now, should we listen to other people? Absolutely. Should we go outside of our tradition and say, what are they saying about Scripture? Is it true? Absolutely. We shouldn't just try to find commentators and theologies that are non-white. We should try to find doctrines and commentaries that are actually true because they comport with Scripture. That's the difference.
I mean, you looked like you were agreeing with some of that, Rasool.
Yeah.
And in that sense, you're quite clear in your essay, Critical Race Theory, that
right.
you're not sort of saying, I'd agree with everything everyone in the critical, all
right.
the key voices in critical race theory say. I mean, what obviously a lot of people are very concerned, though, that by sort of speaking in the terms of critical race theory, that we're somehow then
Right.
imbibing the worldview, this larger worldview, as Neil puts it.
Yeah, I mean, when you talk about the concern, several years ago, John MacArthur wrote, the most dangerous heresy that he's ever faced is the growing Christian advocacy for social justice. Just this week, Owen Strachan, associate professor at Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, called for church discipline, invoking Matthew 18 for anybody who he identified as a woke Christian or who was promoting wokeness. Excommunication. There are heresy hunters who are compiling lists of theologians and pastors like Dr. Eric Mason, who wrote the book Woke Church, got his doctorate at Dallas Theological Seminary, considers Dr. Tony Evans a mentor, as someone who's now anathema, who is now bringing in heresy. Phil Vischer, who gave us Veggie Tales, is now in this category of those who are postmodern Marxists. This is the conversation. This is why this is so important, because there are now people who are saying all of this is under the same umbrella and needs to summarily be rejected, and these people ought to be shunned. That's what we're dealing with. And so I think that, there are aspects of critical race theory, as I had to learn and study it, because it wasn't natural. It wasn't something that even with the Africana Studies major at a major university that I had run across in a systemic way. And that's important because it didn't shape or frame my analysis of the world having a significant racist past and history and present. But what does occur is this aspect of worldview thinking and in the way that how that shapes and what we can take and imbibe and what is interwoven. And some of what makes this complex, as Dr. Esau McCulley has said, is that there are complexities because there's such much of the same conversation that has already been happening within the Black church. But because oftentimes Christian theologians don't take the Black Christian tradition seriously, they overlook and ignore that. There's a presumption of guilt upon anybody who brings up issues of injustice and race as just being all the way and part of this process. And it's a word that is not in season for what is happening right now. There's more attention, more energy, and more focus on the dangers of this, this ideology are being tethered to and then being projected onto what we're saying than it is on the actual problem of racism in our society. We are in the midst of the largest movement of social justice that we've seen in our country, and what Christians are doing now and mainstream are having an argument about epistemology versus ethics. And again, I'm not saying epistemology isn't important. It's very important. But what I am saying is that just because I resonate with various topics like intersectionality, and by the way, I don't have any problem with saying women experience oppression in our society. LGBT people experience being alienated and oppressed in our society. Like those are facts. Now, do I mean by that the same thing as, what Crenshaw means by that, or what Delgado means by that? Probably not. And I'm fine with that. That doesn't mean that I retreat from being able to acknowledge that there is brokenness and that there's pain and that there's abuse in our world. And I think we have to hold those things together. It's critical. And I need folks who are more fair-minded, like Neil, to push back on this tsunami that is coming. That when people start talking about excommunicating folks, that means that they're looking for people to say, okay, you use the word race, you use the word injustice, so now you're going to have church discipline. That's what's happening now.
Yeah. And I get the sense there, just before we go to a break, Neil, that Rasool does believe you can take the good and leave the parts that you don't necessarily agree with. You can, eat the meat and spit out the bones, as it were. You obviously don't feel that you get to do that with CRT for some reason.
Well, here's the comparison I like to make. It's between CRT and queer theory. Now, do queer theorists say absolutely nothing but falsehoods all the time? No. A queer theorist might say something like, particular elements of what we call masculinity and femininity are actually social constructs. And that could be true. For example, dinosaurs in the color blue and fire engines are inherently masculine, and unicorns in the color pink and rainbows aren't inherently feminine. So they'd be right there. But here's the problem. While that limited insight is true, the entire project of queer theory is predicated upon an absolutely deadly falsehood that all elements of gender are socially constructed, that gender itself is an oppressive social construct that needs to be dismantled. So we can't just say, well, I'll eat the meat and spit out the bones. The analogy I use again is that the meat's poisoned, that the very project of queer theory is poisonous. So do they say some true things? Yes, but their fundamental project is dangerous. And I think we should view CRT in a similar way, because they're sort of kissing cousins in a sense. They're related in terms of how they view power and oppression. So that's why I say, I've read literally thousands of pages of CRT at this point, and I can guarantee you, I can confirm it is not 100% garbage. It's not. Some of it's,
but you think that there is ultimately this agenda to kind of basically dismantle the hierarchies and so on. And as far as you're concerned, that means dismantling a lot of Christian orthodoxy at the same time.
Yeah, depending, again, so for example, when Rasool says, I also believe LGBTQ people are oppressed, but not the same way that they might. Well, I hope that's true, because when they say that they're oppressed, they mean they want to dismantle the things that are oppressing them, which would be the gender binary. When they say they want to dismantle whiteness, they mean they want to dismantle things that we might say are actually, that's not whiteness. That's actually things like Christian doctrine. Actually, the Smithsonian had an infographic which listed Judeo-Christian morality as an element of whiteness. So, which is crazy, but it's just there. The Smithsonian said that, drawing on critical race theory. So we have to be very, not just even careful, I would say we should be, boy, oh boy, more than careful when we start adopting this language and these ideas, because they're dangerous.
Quick response, and we'll go to the break, Rasool. Yeah.
It was more of a question. Like, I am making the case that white supremacy and racism is the greatest challenge. It wasn't me that said this, Daniel Hill in his book, White Lies, to unity in the church than anything else right now. What do you see when you see this amalgamation of white nationalism, of, just this intersection of, beliefs with this Make America Great Again kind of motif of like, Jews will not replace us kind of ideology. Do you see that? Do you see any infiltration of nationalism and xenophobia or racism in the mainstream evangelical church at all? Do you see that?
I do see it, but here's the thing. One thing I would say is that critical race theory has redefined white supremacy to mean whiteness being the norm, where whiteness means like the culture and the values of the, of whites. It's complicated. They've redefined these terms. So you have to when you ask, well, is white supremacy in the traditional sense the biggest problem in the church today? even there, I'd say I don't like to rank heresies. It's a problem, absolutely. But here's my concern. I don't know any pastors, even the most radically conservative fundamentalist pastors, who wouldn't get in the pulpit and say racism is a wicked sin, white supremacy is a wicked sin. I know people who are radically fundamentalist and conservative who would say that. Yet I see tons of people who would not be willing to do that about critical race theory, which I would say is equally poisonous. Let's do both. I am happy to denounce traditional racism, traditional white supremacy, but I want to also denounce these ideas because they are, and I can give you lots of examples, but they are entering the evangelical church and having a disastrous effect on our theology.
We're going to go to a quick break, and I'll come back to you, Rasool, because I think this point about whether there's equally a sort of a way in which a kind of nationalistic kind of politicization of that is entering the American politics, and I see this from over here in the UK as a Brit, and obviously, we look on with a certain amount of trepidation as to what's going to be happening, obviously in a few weeks' time. Look, we'll go to a break and we'll come back to these issues. Critical race theory is under debate today. Fantastic conversation between Neil Shenvi and Rasool Berry here on the show, and we'll be back in just a moment.
If you listen to Unbelievable with Justin Briley on Premier Christian Radio and enjoy the conversations between Christians and skeptics, then this is the perfect app for you. For the latest updates, podcasts, videos, articles, bonus content and much more, download the Premier Unbelievable app today.
So in the final part of today's show, we're continuing this discussion on critical race theory. Is it compatible with Christianity? Is it an anathema to Christianity? That's what Neil Shenvi believes, one of my guests on today's show. I'll make sure there are links to Neil from today's program. Rasool Berry, the teaching pastor at the Bridge Church in Brooklyn, recently wrote an article called Critical Race Theory. Now, without endorsing every aspect of critical race theory, he said, however, it is very often a helpful tool to help us understand the power dynamics going on in culture and to help us respond as Christians as we seek to bring truth and light and peace and justice into them. So just before we get back into the conversation we were having, one phrase leapt out at me during that last part of the conversation, and it was cultural Marxism. Can you explain, maybe start with you, Rasool, what you think that means and why it's come into suddenly common parlance and particularly linked with this idea of critical race theory? Yeah,
as someone who's been accused of being a cultural Marxist on many occasions, I had to, again, look it up to figure out what it was that people were accusing me of. It's essentially this idea that, it's evolved over time. When you first see it initially, Bill, I can't remember his Lamb. I can't remember his last name. Lind. Thank you. Bill Land, in the 90s is writing about it in response to what he's looking at as political correctness at the time. That was the big hot button issue, and using the right terms and saying that political correctness is an expression of Marxism in the terms of controlling what you can say or how you express yourself. It has now evolved over the last 20, 30 years to mean basically kind of be lumped into this idea of talking about oppression, since Marx and others like the Frankfurt School, who are very much Marxists and things, that there's this this vision of the world, this analysis that looks at a dialectic of oppressor and oppressed classes, that's essentially a Marxist concept, and that ultimately what cultural Marxists seek to do is essentially, as opposed to the old method, which was to do violent overthrow of the government, that a new school decided, that didn't really work out too well, or let's try to persuade hearts and minds with the same ideology, and then that way, we can kind of have this Trojan horse come into society and then take it over. Interestingly enough, there's it's the son of another idea called cultural Bolshevikism, which was coined in Germany in the 1930s. Which had to do with anything that was associated with or thought to be Marxist, or at that point Bolshevik, and it included abstract art, It was a broad construct that was used to primarily paint as anti-Semitic Jewish people. So cultural Bolshevism in the 30s, which leads into the Third Reich, and then cultural Marxism is basically the same term, just updated. And it's a conspiracy theory, ultimately, that is so broad in its implication that anything can fit into it, and everything that sounds anything different than what people look at as the status quo. That's my perspective on cultural Marxism.
How helpful is this phrase in your view, Neil?
So I think it's unhelpful, because if you Google the phrase cultural Marxism, like half of the links say it's a conspiracy theory, it's anti-Semitic, it goes back to Bill Lind. So it's half the links. Now, unfortunately, that's just not true. There's a great article called Cultural Marxism, Imaginary Conspiracy or Revolutionary Reality, published by the Gospel Coalition's journal Themelios, written by Robert Smith. It's 10,000 words long. It's very long and detailed. But he points out that the phrase cultural Marxism has been around for decades and was used by scholars to describe the work of the Frankfurt School. So it's not a conspiracy theory. It really exists.
No.
Yeah.
What I said is the term, the semantic range of the term has been stretched to include everything under the sun, in the same way that cultural Bolshevism is. So even when the way Bill Land used it in the 90s is not the way it's being talked about now. It's different. So that stretching is the thing that I'm saying has become unhelpful and unuseful, because basically it's become anything that sounds different than what a certain political and social ideology has been.
Okay, so yeah, I agree it's unhelpful, but it's not, it does actually, it's a real academic term. It's been used for decades by people who promoted it. So it's not just a conspiracy theory.
But real quick, I just want to say, in the same way that you refer to those terms like intersectionality or oppression as terms that can have a whole lot invested in it, I'm saying that cultural Marxism is the same way. And
it's obviously covers a wide range of bases these days, and people do tend to throw it around. I mean, the problem is, as I see it, you're both in that sense anti-racist, but even the term anti-racism has now come to become a loaded term. And when I first heard the word anti-racist, I thought, well, yeah, any sensible person, right-thinking person should be anti-racist. But now a lot of people seem to think it involves a certain way of seeing the world and this critical race theory approach to things and everything else. So it's very hard, isn't it? Because the terms change and different people have different, views of what's involved in any particular thing. I did want to come back to you, Rasool, with some more thoughts, because I get the sense that you haven't wanted to adopt this label for yourself, critical race theory. You're just and you're saying it doesn't explain everything about me, and ultimately you're a Christian first and foremost before you are in any sense a critical race theorist. Mm-hmm. But that you simply believe there's been a bit of a knee-jerk sort of defensive reaction to the use of it in evangelical circles.
Yeah, and it's founded historically. I mean, every time there has been there's a book Mark Knoll wrote, Civil War as a Theological Debate. And you look at the approach in the 1850s and 60s of the two sides in Christianity. One were opposed to slavery, the other, were supporting of it. That essentially one side, the side that was opposed to it, were labeled as heretical, as, oh, you're not really committed to the Bible like we are, because if you were, you'd see that there's no problem with slavery. And any attempt to broaden and say, wait a minute, there's some themes of liberation in the scripture that are clearly here, and clearly whipping and raping and kidnapping millions of people can't fit into a Christian ethos. Well, there was a whole war fought about it. And theologically, people, that's how you get the Baptist convention. That's how you get the Presbyterian PCA convention. Like, there are literally churches that split. Same thing in segregation. If you just Google segregation signs, Bible verses, you'll see people holding up signs that say integration is communism, integration is, segregation is biblical. And that's the theme. That's why a place like Bob Jones University would have a ban on interracial relationships until the year 2000. And it only changed then because of the pressure that got put on it when President George Bush visited the campus. And so when we see this new iteration, I'm not surprised sense that there is a consternation when we bring up issues of race and injustice, that people are pushing back on that, because that has been the pattern every time that this has come up in American history and really, in world history. But I think that it's so, and I think about critical race theory. Again, I only have these conversations in evangelical space. Like that's not something I think about and I interact with as a way of defining how I think about the world. Are there some things that I've learned, that I've embodied, that I feel like are valuable, such as intersectionality, that I think there's some helpful things there? Not everything. Yeah. White fragility, does that explain some observable phenomena that I know to be true and that I've experienced? Yes. Now, do I agree with everything with Robin DiAngelo, I'm butchering her name, but the author of the books has said? No. And so, but again, I've had to do that when I open my theology books and I see people talking about the curse of Ham, and I see people talking about that's a justification for slavery. Or if I read sermons or old treatises from people who were using the Bible to justify oppression, that I've had to also do the same thing. So it's not I look at it as all truth is God's truth. And so anytime I come into something that a human has written, that I have to look at that upon with scrutiny, but also realize that there's some wisdom that can be gained from it.
Neil, we're going to start wrapping things up, but yeah, would you like to respond, and then we'll start to get some final thoughts from you both?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with Rasool that there are two dangers here. One is to label everybody who's, everyone is a critical race theorist, everyone's a cultural Marxist. Anyone who talks about justice is, a communist. I agree that's a problem. I'm fully behind that. I really want to be precise, accurate, charitable. That's all fine. But I want him to also recognize there's another side of the problem. There's another huge problem within evangelicalism today. And I'm going to pull out some quotes and I want him and other people like him to speak out. If he says, eat the meat, spit out the bones, well, then identify the bones for us. Tell us exactly how dangerous this is. It's really dangerous. So there's a book published in 2019 called Can White People Be Saved? Published by InterVarsity Press with a number of Fuller Seminary professors writing there. It says explicitly they draw on cutting edge theory in racial studies and critical theorists who analyze race. Here are some quotes. Here's one from Andrea Smith's essay, Decolonizing Salvation. What we presume to be true of the Bible is primarily the result of the history of European interpretation as translated into European languages. We would have a completely different understanding of the Bible if we read it through indigenous languages. According to the European positivist grammar of truth, if proposition P is true, then not P must be false. Indigenous epistemologies, indigenous ways of knowing, are not beholden to such logic systems. Beliefs like Christianity and indigenous religions can coexist in indigenous culture. She's saying, I know that it sounds like Christianity and indigenous religions are contradictory, and they are according to European logic. But if we get rid of that European logic, then they can coexist. Here's an essay called The End of Mission by Andrew Draper. Whiteness is best understood as a religious system of pagan idol worship. It's as idolatry, whiteness must be dealt with like any such cultic system. Its high places must be torn down and its altars laid low. Christian discipleship that entails a deconversion from whiteness is necessary if any true experience of reconciliation with God, others, the creation, and ourselves is to take place. And it's the essays are like full of these crazy ideas.
That's plenty for Rasool to respond to there. I wish we had longer to debate some of these issues. The phrase whiteness alone obviously has all kinds of places we could go with it. But okay, so I'm anticipating your response here, Rasool. Well, I don't agree with everything every scholar says about the way we need to treat these texts or whatever. But is there some truth in those kinds of quotes about, look, if we just had received our text through a very different filter, very different cultural filter, we might come out with some kind of different doctrines about Christianity?
Yeah, I think one of the things, and I will remind all of us the fact that in my article, I do significantly criticize critical race theory and critical theory in general, and for its epistemological contradictions that are there within. So I know I've been kind of in this mode of kind of seeing value, but I do want to recognize that I see contradiction, and that's a problem. But when it comes,
you do call it the promise and perils of
yes,
CRT.
Right,
That's
right.
the subtitle of your article. Yes.
Yeah. Ultimately, any attempts. Well, I'll let Herman Bavinck to come at a heavy lifting. He wrote, "Wisdom is grounded on science, but is not limited to it." And then Nathaniel Grace Sutanto, he recently wrote a really insightful article about Bavinck, where he talks about this issue of worldview and some of the ways that we come to think about it now. He says, Bavinck was eager to present Christianity not just as an opposing philosophy, but rather as a fuller philosophy that fulfills and accommodates other worldviews. He wants to show that Christianity offers a pervasive metaphysics that is anticipated by and fulfills the perspectives of philosophers and scientists. And what I think Sutanto was saying, and what he's reading from Bavinck, is that sometimes we have this approach to worldview that looks to delegitimize and to essentially cancel anybody who may come from a different worldview because wait a minute, they might smuggle in perspectives that are different that are not true. But honestly, if we look at Christianity as what he's saying Bavinck did, is the fulfillment that one, in the Hebrew tradition of wisdom, that wisdom was higher than knowledge, and that there was a sense of skill for living. Some of that skill embodies this aspect of lived experience. That there's some aspect of mystery that has often been lost in the not just Western tradition, but the post-Enlightenment rationalistic emphasis tradition that sees that as the only way of knowing, and that has lost some of those more mystical ways and approaches, lost some of the wonder, lost some of the mystery. And so I haven't read that article that he quoted fully from, so I'm not going to try to, respond fully to it. But I will say, I could see a scenario where there is a different mindset and mission to go in and say, I have to bring God to the heathen that had within it a lot of bad theology, a lot of race and racism, because it was heathens and savages that had no knowledge of God, as opposed to saying, I'm going to show up where God has already in some place revealed himself, which we know just from the aspect of common grace and general revelation is a principle, but that may not be fully revealed. In the book Eternity in Their Hearts, there's story after story after story that Bill Richardson reveals about how when people came to show up and they started explaining about this person who died for their sin and resurrected, they're like, oh, they already had it built into their tradition and they were looking for that. There's a different mindset of joining God in mission versus I am the person that's the victor that's coming in to save, and not do what one of the colonels in the American Army did in the 1870s when they were trying to figure out the Indian problem. And instead of just wiping them all out, which was the previous strategy, they decided to create boarding schools to kill the Indian and save the man. This is a intersection of culture, of spirit, of religious ideology, and all mixed in together in someone's soteriology that to them to be Christian meant to cut their hair, to disconnect them from their language, to strip them of their clothes and their culture in order to save the man. So when I think about that, I go, yeah, that needs to be critiqued, because that is a horrible witness to the world, and it's totally, an unjust system that has happened, and those vestiges of that still exist. And so when we think about missions today, it's just been within the last century that, Hudson Taylor and others, the influence of them that says, oh, wait a minute, I can just embody the culture that I'm in and not try to completely destroy it.
It's been a fascinating discussion, both. Thank you very much. Final thoughts, if you would, both folks. Where do we, I guess, move on from here? What would you like to see people go away with, Neil, from this when it comes to how they go and actually engage in practical ways with people of other color and everything else? What's the kind of practical takeaway for the Christian who's thinking, I've heard a lot, what do I go and do now?
One thing I would just say is that the Bible and the Christian worldview have all we need for life and godliness. So that's true. We can learn things from, other disciplines, from secular disciplines. That's true, but we have to always test it against the Bible. So obviously, you don't have to reject modern medicine. You don't have to reject science as a Christian, but you have to test what people are telling you against Scripture primarily. And my worry here is that when you look at the actual core tenets of critical race theory as they're expounded by these theorists, they conflict in so many places overtly with what the Bible teaches. Now, if you want to take a truth here and a truth there and say, well, I can learn from that truth and that truth, that's fine. But please make clear to people exactly where the conflict lies. There's a deep, deep, deep foundational conflict in a way of viewing reality that's happening all over the place. And when you begin to see seminary professors not spitting out the bones, but choking on the bones, when you see them saying outrageous things, you ought to be worried, and you ought to wonder, how should I hand these books to a random layperson in my congregation if even seminary professors are getting confused and buying into dangerous doctrines? That's what I would worry about. And I see it happening more and more. So I agree with Pastor Rasool. We should be kind, charitable. We should listen carefully. We should not jump to conclusions. We should ask questions. But I think we also have to stand firm by saying this really is a movement, an ideology, even a worldview maybe, that is tremendously influential in our culture and is eroding the Christian faith in many ways. And we have to stand against it. Doesn't mean being a big jerk, but it means identifying the problems and saying, stay away from these.
Final thoughts from you as well, Rasool.
Yeah. First of all, let me say I commend Neil for his commitment to the gospel. I as someone who's an evangelist at heart, an apologist at heart, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to move to New York City, because I saw the danger of postmodernism and the influence that it was having on worldview. And I wanted to kind of get into the belly of the beast to understand how to contend for the faith in a time where people are looking at it and calling it and considering it post-Christian. So I appreciate that effort. I appreciate the zeal in which you want to guard against that. And I do recognize that the slippage that is occurring in the ways in which the foundation, so to speak, of people's biblical confidence in the Bible, confidence in in objective truth of Jesus' salvation is waning in different ways. I mean, you can just look at Pew Research or Barna and see, the trends that exist. And I'm deeply concerned about that. And I've seen that in our own congregation. So I'm not here to deny that. At the same time, Dr. Carl Ellis, who's an incredible mentor, he wrote a book, Free at Last, where he talks about side A and side B of the gospel. Side A being the epistemological concerns, side B being the ethical concerns, that ultimately people in positions of power oftentimes are more focused on the epistemological than the ethical. Right now, we're in a incredible season of suffering in our world when you look at a global pandemic, and one that doesn't play fair, that it disproportionately impacts people who are suffering, that the Bible talks about the poor, the oppressed, the foreigner, which you can kind of invest in this idea of ethnic difference, that these are problems. We have a legacy of rape. As an apologist in the Black community, the number one issue that I have is with people who say Christianity is a white man's religion, because look at what it's done. And so I have to contend against that. That's what I'm up against. So when I talk about the liberation themes in the Bible, it's not because I'm being influenced by something that started being written in the 1970s. It's because I'm drawing from the Frederick Douglasses, who said that, I love the pure, peaceable religion of Christ, which is why I despise the hypocritical, slave-holding, women-whipping religion of this land. Between the two, there can be no greatest, separation. When I look at the ESV Study Bible and I look in Luke chapter 4, verse 18, and its note for when Jesus says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he's anointed me to proclaim, freedom to the captive, recovery of sight to the blind. It notes Jesus's ministry included forgiving sins and ethical teachings that promote social justice. That is just there. And so I am for promoting this aspect of ethical concern and justice in a time in which is desperately needed. And even when our witness as apologists demand that we give an answer, and more than just in words, but in actions about what's happening. And so to me, because I want to be faithful as an evangelist, that also means proclaiming good news, not just in my words, but in my actions. That's what we try to do with being anti-racist.
Thank you so much both for being such great guests, and just for this really helpful opening up of this discussion, and for being gracious as well in the way that you've engaged with each other. I'll make sure there are links to you both from today's show as well, if you want to find out more about Rasool and Neil. But for now, thanks very much for being with me on today's program.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Justin. Thanks, Rasool.
Yep.
For more conversations between Christians and skeptics, subscribe to the Unbelievable podcast. And for more updates and bonus content, sign up to the Unbelievable newsletter.